when you asked me to pick out sort of 3 issues around the theme of opportunities and challenges in making good policy, and being an ex-politician, obviously start with the challenges and then move on to the opportunity rather than the other way around, because that's what you have to do in politics in many respects. You start at the challenge end because that's what's immediately with you. The first challenge that one faces in making good policy is the dominance of self-interest, or if I want to be more precise, the dominance of perceived self-interest, because that'll lead me on to my second small theme. I think it's a truism of politics by and large that most people will vote according to how they see their own self-interest in relation to the issues of the day. We like to think that we are a very generous and unselfish group of people, but when it comes to the ballot box, it is surprising how often the issues come down to what's in it for me, as one reporter famously ran down the corridors of the Beehive yelling after I presented about my 4th budget, by which she meant there was nothing in it for her because there was no tax cut for people on her level of income. And that then biased her reporting of that particular budget. And I think a good example of that, and it's a theme you've been picking up already, is the issue of the spending on children and young people versus the spending on the elderly and the old. I mean, every Minister of Finance is faced with the issues: where does the pot get divided up? Where am I going to propose spending this money? And that is becoming, of course, increasingly pointed, because as the number of elderly people increase in the proportion of the population, so of course the proportion of voters who are elderly becomes that much larger. And that's intensified by the fact that there's a pretty clear line of relationship between the percentage of people who vote running from low amongst the young to high amongst the elderly, who also tend to be clustered around 2 key issues: pensions and healthcare. If they're happy, they can think about other things, but pensions and healthcare are the prime sort of interests in life. You're looking at somebody who doesn't believe 71 is the new 61. I'm 71, I've got a pacemaker, I have to take pills to control my chronic ulcerative colitis, I should be wearing my hearing aids, I will by the end of this year have 2 new lenses in my eyes, I take Symbicort for asthma, and so on. In other words, if all these medical things didn't exist, I wouldn't be here. I certainly wouldn't be here, and I might not even be here at all. And that's why now, one of the reasons now why we've got a lot more elderly people. It's not the only one, but it's becoming increasingly important. Now, the problem with that is that it seems a challenge of how do we pay for the elderly? That's not the real issue in my view. The real issue is, having paid for the elderly in the future, what will be left over for the young? Because the dominance of elderly amongst the voting population will mean the question will not be how do we pay for them, they'll make sure they are paid for. The question is what's left over for the young to make sure the things that younger people need, including children need, are being provided for. What's the opportunity out of that? I think the opportunity is to attack some very fundamental issues, which are quite difficult ones because it's quite contrary to the prevailing orthodoxy of the last 30 years, which I can come back to on occasions. The first is a selfish society the most successful kind of a society? We've been running with the theory propounded by neoclassical economists that if people pursue their own self-interest, this will maximise social benefits to practically everybody. And those few are left can be picked up through benefit systems and whatever, but we shouldn't really have those either because they don't encourage people to be self-motivated. So that's the kind of theory which has been governing largely what we do. If we say, is it actually true? No, it's not. It's very easy to point to contrary examples across the world and across time, which tells you that selfish societies are not the most successful. The reason we organise ourselves in society is because deep down, we actually know that works better than if we operate as atomised individuals. The second is to try to get across to old people like me that the future of the elderly is dependent upon the future success of today's generation of children and young people. People who are my age or a few years younger, we can expect to live now for another I don't expect to live another, what it is, but another 15 to 20 years into around about 90. So we're going to be dependent on people of your age to be paying for New Zealand super and the healthcare system when we are at that stage. So how well you are doing is going to have a great deal of effect on how well we are going to be doing when we get to that point. So even in terms of self-interest, you can turn that argument around. The second challenge is a very important one. People frequently fail to identify what their true self-interest is. Have any of you ever studied Marx, which probably nobody does these days? Marx had this notion of forced consciousness, which is a sort of way of expressing the idea of true self-interest in class terms. And my example of that one is business spokespeople in inequality. Business keeps telling you that what you have to do is to lower corporate taxes and lower personal taxes, the upper level, and so on and so forth. And the fact that it leads to increasing inequality is of no concern because that doesn't matter. That will help drive further innovation, further productivity growth, and greater well-being. Again, of course, that's not identifying their true self-interest. Business, by and large, does better when the vast majority of the people are reasonably well off and able to consume their goods and services. If 25 or 30% or more of the population is unable to afford a large range of goods and services, then businesses are struggling within a much smaller effective market than would otherwise be the case. There are only so many, well, I was about to say cars you can buy, and I just bought a new Jag XE, so I shouldn't say that. There are only so many things that people can purchase in many respects before they run out of and get sated by that particular. I mean, if you just a simple example of, a Big Mac. How many Big Macs, don't answer this something, how many Big Macs can you actually afford to buy before you pass the point of sort of diminishing returns or increasing size, whichever way you look at it? So the opportunity there is to develop what you might call evidence-based policy. Who bears the cost of education and who benefits from that? The state largely bears the cost. Who benefits from that? Largely the private sector. Why should people from the private sector argue for policies which reduce the ability of the state to in fact provide a good education? They largely freeload upon that public spending. Who bears the cost of infrastructure development? Overwhelmingly in New Zealand, still the state bears the cost of a very large portion of infrastructure development. With poor infrastructure, you have a poor economy and poor business growth. These are fundamental. It's why there is no clear relationship between high levels of taxation as a proportion of GDP and economic growth and prosperity. Because while one may act as a disincentive, on the other hand, it provides the infrastructure, the skills, and all those things which are needed for effective businesses, particularly in the modern world. Final challenge I want to mention is one I think you covered already in many respects. The very great tendency to engage in short-term thinking and short-term commentary within the political commentariat, particularly the media. That is to say, what's going to be the effect of this policy on the public perception of the government in the next 48 hours? Which is sort of not usually the right question to ask about almost any policy development. It's what's it going to be doing in 1 year, 5 years, 25 years' time. And the classic examples are, again, the issue of ageing of the population and the issue of global warming. Now, I've got to declare a personal interest. I live on a sandspit, the eastern end of a Hopi, and I get very interested in issues of global sea levels rising because they don't have to rise very much to sort of wipe out where Anne and I live. But nevertheless, this is a major issue, clearly. There aren't many people who pretend that we're not facing human-induced global warming at the present time. And not many people don't realise that this is going to cause huge disruption for some countries, by no means all. For Pacific Island states, some of them, massive disruption. But a country like Bangladesh, which has millions and millions and millions of people living just a short level above the sea, that's really how that place has developed, because it is on a great big a river delta. But governments have been signally failing to act sufficiently well. We've had a recent agreement, but nobody is very confident it will actually be implemented properly. And even if it is, it won't do enough. So in fact, we have to think also about what kind of amelioration we're going to have to engage in, not just how we stop is happening, because we're already nearly halfway towards the 2 degrees Celsius marking point. We're 0.9 degrees of the way towards that 2 degrees. And carbon dioxide doesn't go away for a long period of time. Once it's up there, it stays up there. And so we are not going to actually stop it completely. But how do we deal with this short-term thinking? And I think Treasury is quite right to say that we need to try to develop long-term frameworks for analysing some of these problems. They cannot be analysed on a short-term basis. But how does one convince people, and people commenting on these matters, to talk in that respect? Let me just quickly finish with an example of this. It's something that's not particularly long-term. The government finally decided to think about doing something about the housing market in Auckland. Many things need to be done about the housing market in Auckland. But the idea of a land tax was put forward, or floated by the PM about 36 hours ago. Within 24 hours, it was approaching being dead in the water, as the political commentators started talking about the political impact, and the story started spreading, we'd all be paying land tax, and therefore everybody got frightened, and now it's dead. We've done the same thing to raising the age of super, we've done the same thing to capital gains tax, and the same thing to any number of policy issues which require proper thought about their long-term implications. Now, if we keep going around that cycle of short-term thinking, we are going to end up with very, very suboptimal policies in a whole range of areas, and very, very suboptimal outcomes as a consequence of that. That's a challenge that my generation of politicians has not addressed particularly well at all. It's a challenge the current generation of politicians is probably addressing even worse at the present time. It's a challenge that your generation of politicians, who's going to inherit a lot of mistakes because of that, will have to start trying to address if we are going to do better. And we're not going to do it just by believing in the efficient markets hypothesis. It will take a great deal more than that. Thank you.